So Dr. Wolfgang Gabbert is professor of development sociology and cultural anthropology at the Leibniz University in Hanover in Germany. He's a board member of the Center for Atlantic and Global Studies with research interests in the sociology of violence and marginal groups throughout the Americas. Today, we will be discussing his book, Violence and the Caste War in Yucatan, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. So thank you for being here with me.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
So the first couple questions I always do are just kind of like more personal questions, and then I ask more research-oriented questions. Then we kind of dive into the actual topic of the book. So just the first question is, how did you get into the field of sociology, and what made you want to research the caste war, and what made you want to research Mexican history?
Yeah, well, I come from a working class family, and from an early age, I was interested in social issues and angered by injustice. So sociology therefore seemed to me an attractive subject. I was initially in my studies interested mainly in issues related to the labor movement and the history of trade unions, mostly in Germany. But a university seminar on the conflict between the Sandinista government in Nicaragua and the ethnic groups of the Atlantic coast of this region in the early 1980s. A seminar given by my later friend Volker Wünderich changed the direction of my studies and also my life. The question of the seminar was why an actually progressive government could get into massive contradictions with the ethnic groups. Of course, geopolitics, especially the US-financed counter-revolutionary war, the Contra War, played a decisive role in the conflict. But it also became clear quite clearly that the history of the relations between the national state of Nicaragua and the Atlantic region played an enormous role, and the economic and social forms of the ethnic groups. So I wanted to learn more about this, and so I began to study anthropology. For practical reasons, I was still writing my PhD thesis in sociology. At that time, that was in the last millennium, in 1991, the thesis was the first social history on the Afro-American population of the Atlantic coast, the so-called Creoles, in the Nicaraguan Atlantic coast. Lamentably, it was written in German and not in English. However, because of my growing interest in anthropological issues, I then wanted to do my habilitation in anthropology. So, as you might know, the habilitation is a second kind of doctoral thesis that is required in Germany if you want to be hired as a professor at university. If you want to work in anthropology, you usually have to realize a long-term field research. And now I come to the second question, why Yucatan? My then partner and later wife, who was working on her PhD at the same time, and me, we wanted to do our anthropological fieldwork on different topics, but in the same region for being together. And she had already done archaeological work on the Maya area, mostly in Guatemala. And so we finally decided to do research in a rural region in the Yucatan Peninsula in southeastern Mexico, particularly in the state of Campeche. In the 1990s, we were there living and working for more than a year. And then we came back later to the region for shorter periods again and again. The Yucatan Peninsula is a region with a strong influence of the indigenous population, as you might know, and most of the spring breakers who visit Cancun will know that perfectly well. The numerous material legacies of the pre-Hispanic Maya culture attract thousands of tourists each year. In addition, the region is home to a significant proportion of speakers of indigenous languages, and consequently, the region's history and present are interpreted by many scientific and non-scientific observers essentially as a dispute between two ethnic groups, indigenous Maya on the one hand, and non-indigenous, the so-called whites or vecinos in Spanish, on the other. Ethnicity appears, therefore, as a key element in understanding the region. I had already dealt intensively with the topic of ethnicity in my work on Nicaragua. Now, I wanted to examine the history of inter-ethnic relations in Yucatan from the Spanish conquest to the present in my habilitation project. The results of it have been published in 2004 in my book, Becoming Maya, Ethnicity and Social Inequality in Yucatan since 1500. Those who study inter-ethnic relations in Yucatan automatically come across the so-called Caste War that shook the peninsula between 1847 and 1901, and that permanently altered the economic and social structures of the peninsula. It was among the most important rural insurgencies in the 19th century Mexico for several reasons: its duration and magnitude, the tremendous loss of human life, several 10,000s of people died, and also the loss of material resources. In addition, it also had profound consequences for the structure of the peninsula, for it led to a factual separation of the region into two zones, one controlled by the government and the southeast controlled by the rebels and their descendants for about half a century. The drama of the Caste War had attracted my attention already many years ago when I read Nelson Reed's fascinating study on the Caste War of Yucatan. To understand what moved people to commit gross acts of violence was a riddle that has puzzled me from the beginning. And although the general cause of the war was well documented, there were very few works that concentrated on the violence of the Caste War when I started the research for my book. There were some exceptions: the pioneering work of Paul Sullivan, US anthropologist and historian, and books of Marta Villalobos Gonzalez and Terry Rougley. Terry Rougley, formerly from Texas University. So that was a way I got. It's a long way from German trade unions to the Yucatecan Caste War.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's just always contingencies of how we end up researching what we research. I'm interested in also like why you study violence, because I feel like that's also something I've read quite a bit on in German historiography, possibly because of the Nazi period and the Holocaust. And so I've read quite a few books of how did the Nazis come about? How did we get to this place? Was that influential at all in you coming to study how violence occurs, or was it separately?
No, that was really separately. I mean, as a German, you are always confronted with the Third Reich and the massacres on the Jewish population and all that stuff. That has been present for my whole life, and that was. I'm not a 68er, as one would say. I was born later, but these discussions about the Nazi past, of course, influenced the discussions, particularly in the critical public for many years after the Second World War. This past, or many people tried to forget about this past, and the continuities there were in parts of the institutions. For example, we had several judges who played an important role in the Third Reich, and who also later in the Bundesrepublik, in the German Republic after the war, still played an important role in politics and as judges. But there were so many violent deeds and processes all around. I mean, it was not just the Second World War. Then there were the anti-colonial wars of the 1950s, mostly Algerian War was widely discussed. It was also before I was born. But then in the 1960s, the Vietnam War played an enormous role. And of course, all the violent confrontations that happened in Latin America, the guerrilla movements and the counterinsurgency war of the governments linked to the US government at that time, and in the well, considering the confrontation between the big political blocs of the East and the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc. So it was more important than this Third Reich, I guess.
Okay, yeah. But have you noticed any differences between reading the historiographies in Mexican history versus maybe historiographies in North America or German talking about the caste war or talking about the Yucatan?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I would say the situation of scholars studying Latin America and in Germany is quite different from that in the US. I mean, Mexico for the US is a neighboring country, and you have anthropology departments at almost all universities, and many of them, maybe most of them, also the history departments are somewhat related to issues of Latin America. That's not the case in Germany. So German scholars working on Latin America are relatively few, and so you are specialized, and you're more looking beyond Germany. I mean, there are a few colleagues that you can discuss your issues with, but that somebody is working on the same topic is not the rule. So you would look for maybe Great Britain, but mostly for Mexican itself, and of course to the United States, if you're looking what are the relevant discussions and who is working these topics.
So in terms of this book, what would you say was the hardest part of research for this book? Was there any particular archive or interviews that were difficult in Campeche when you were there for a year, or was it more finding resources outside of it, or what was the hardest part of the research?
I mean, I had never any problems during my research. I had many practical problems, maybe the heat and the dust and situation in archives that were more or less well organized. But almost of the people I met, and also the archivists, they were very helpful and nice. And I mean, Yucatan is also a nice region to work in. For people are generally very friendly, and social relations are not so tense and violent as they are in other regions. I mean, if you think of Chiapas, for example, they had many more even violent conflicts with hacienda owners and farm workers and the indigenous groups, but also within the indigenous communities. And Yucatan was and still is a relatively peaceful region in Mexico. So that was not a problem. People also talked with me about many issues, and that was also one episode that was leading me the way I later took for during my first study on the social inequality and ethnicity. I made several interviews about the past of the region. And I also interviewed a couple of Maya-speaking people then, and they had a quite different view on the Caste War rebels than was the official discourse. For the interpretation of the Caste War has changed quite a lot. It was considered by the Yucatecan elites as a war of civilization against barbarism, as a racial war. And then the interpretation changed after the Mexican Revolution, when Lázaro Cárdenas became president, and the whole thing of agrarian reform was begun. And then the Caste War was interpreted by the Mexican government as a kind of precursor of the agrarian reform, the rightful struggle of the Maya Indians for their agricultural rights. And then in later times, since the 17th and 18th, it was more integrated into a kind of autonomy discourse, and it has been frequently depicted as a kind of liberation war of the Maya ethne. And then the rebels were interpreted, were depicted quite differently as barbarians in the 19th century, and then as freedom fighters in the 20s, later 20th century. And then when I made the interviews I just mentioned, I met Maya speakers who saw them not as freedom fighters, but as dangerous people, as people who attacked the villages and people who had no mercy. And then I was asking myself, well, how comes? One interpretation posted by some scholars was that was a result of an alienated consciousness. I doubted this a bit, and then during my studies I found out that these people were completely right. For it was not a conflict between the Maya people on the one hand and the whites or mestizos on the other hand, but as I argued in the people, and I hope to have it shown convincingly, it was a conflict between groups that were that had a heterogeneous composition, and that meant that also many Maya speakers became victims of rebel assaults, and so the attitude of these interviews was quite adequate to their historical experience. Okay, that was a bit. We were going astray from your question. So we were asking about the hardships, or what was hard about the research. I would say two things were a bit hard. I mean, researching and going to the archives doesn't bother me. I like that very much. What was a bit hard was putting together the detailed information on the various acts of violence data such as a number of combatants and victims, their age, their sex, and their ethnic category, as far as one could get this information, the amount and the character of booty taken, for example, during raids. These were with information I had to reconstruct from the bits and pieces from several thousand documents, and that was a bit arduous.
Mm.
And the second challenge, I would say, was to keep things going. For that means finding enough time to analyze this amount of or data and writing the manuscript in addition to the ordinary duties of teaching and administrative work I had in university, and therefore it took quite long to finish the manuscript and the book. And that was a bit hard.
So my next question was kind of like, was there an aha moment that kind of fit everything together in your research? It kind of seems like that's what when you were interviewing this Mayan character who kind of, his opinion about the war kind of flipped on the head what everyone had thought of how Mayans should think about the caste war, which is also kind of my view of when I was reading your book, because I kind of came into this idea of the caste war as kind of federal Mexican national troops squashing a Mayan independence movement, something like that. And then your book kind of contradicts that in a lot of ways. I'm not sure if I'm completely convinced, but it definitely got me thinking, and got me thinking about the different ways that we legitimize violence. Like, to what degree are the Mayan rebels synonymous with maybe Pancho Villa, who also was very violent to a lot of local communities. Sometimes he's considered revolutionary, sometimes he's considered a bandit, or even some of the revolutionary groups in Africa who make money off of diamonds, but they consider themselves revolutionary. But who's to say what violence is legitimate? Is any violence legitimate at all? So if nothing else, your book got me really thinking about it, and it paired well with the other book on the Yucatan I was reading. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's In Our Spheres of Life by Alma Duran-Merck. She's writing about German immigrants to the Yucatan, and how, even though the typical historiographical idea is that Germans came and were upper class and kind of situated themselves with the upper crust white community of Mexico, her argument is that a lot of them actually integrated in with the Mayan communities in the Yucatan because they came in as lower class. So I guess all that is to say is, to what degree do you think that there's an intersection of race and class in the Yucatan, in terms at least of how people study it? And how do you untangle that? Like, to what degree? I feel like probably North American scholars focus more on race, and then maybe Mexican scholars more on class. But I might be that's really just a guess. But yeah, so how did you come at that with untangling? To what degree are these, is race a factor? To what degree is class a factor?
Well, biology tells us first that human races do not exist. This is not a biologically thinking a relevant category with reference to humans. What does exist, of course, is racism. That is the idea that certain qualities ascribed to certain categories of people, such as Africans or Amerindians or whites, would be part of their biological endowment. But ideas about race have changed quite a lot in the past centuries. In the 19th century, for example, the notions of race, class, and nation were not clearly separated. And I think that's that's very important to get this clear. When we talk about race today, this is not the same as when people in the 16th, 17th, or 18th, or 19th century talked about and thought about race. In the 19th century, it was assumed, among other things, that social and cultural characteristics could be reflected in phenotype. That would be people of the lower classes would have a certain phenotypical appearance, or that you could, is an interesting work of a journalist or Mayu in England who talked about the wandering tribes of England, and who describes the vagrants with high cheekbones and other physical qualities. And at that time, even progressive biologists were unable to differentiate between changes in the behavior repertoire of populations that were based on learning on the one hand, and those founded on inheritance. So Lamarck's suggestion about the inheritance of acquired characteristics was accepted well into the 20th century. In Yucatan and in the rest of Latin America and Europe, the idea that a biological improvement of the indigenous part of the population could be achieved by education, the introduction of private property and urban life, as well as by a mixture of races, was very common. So that was not seen as different and separate ways, but all that would result in biological changes. The Yucatecan historian and journalist Justo Sierra O'Reilly, for example, regarded the aversion of both the Indian and white races in his writings, who have mixed relationships sanctified by law and religion, as he wrote. A fertile germ of the race war that he wrote in the late 1840s. However, the intended result of the mingling of races was not a mixed culture and population, but the absorption of the Indians by the prevailing mass of the white population. There was no doubt at that time that the center of the Mexican nation was to be sought in the white race. Hopes were pinned on the immigration of Europeans to push ahead the process of lightening society. So the main idea was the future of Mexico would be a white race and not a mestizo race. That was the whole ideology of mestizaje that was developed later in the course of the Mexican Revolution and so on. And so one can, or it's sometimes hard to differentiate between race and class in the 19th century. For the Indians in contemporary discourse were sometimes referred to as a class of Indians, and sometimes as a race. And I mean, this, let's say, conflation of notions had a realistic background for the elites, let's say, were relatively endogamous. So between the lower classes and the higher classes, there was a relatively strict separation in concerning marriage, let's say, not sexual intercourse. That wasn't. That was another thing. And so that means that people of the lower class and people of the upper class were identified with biological traits as well as with property and cultural traits. And so they were somewhat mixed up. And so you couldn't differentiate very clearly what is racial and what is a class issue. I don't know if that is an answer to your question.
Well, it's at the very least explaining why it's difficult to answer. Like, because if they are tied in so well, how do you figure out how to separate them? Or maybe they didn't. What you're saying is they didn't actually separate them in the 19th century. So class oftentimes was race, and race was class. So then, how can you interpret the Yucatan caste war as a means of a fight between two heteronymous groups consisting of Mayans and European descended Mexicans on one side, and then also Mayans and other groups on the other side?
Yeah, I mean that's relatively easy. For if you look at those groups, you can see that their composition is quite heterogeneous. I mean, taking for example the rebels, the rebels integrated any kind of people. They even an important part of their leaders weren't considered by contemporaries not non-Indian. They were considered vecinos. They integrated people of African descent from Belize. They integrated Chinese workers who fled from Belize. They also integrated many deserters from the government troops. The Mexican government, the central government, sent, particularly in the 1850s and 60s, several thousand Mexican soldiers from central Mexico down to Yucatan. Many of them were convicts, vagrants, criminals that were condemned to serve their term in Yucatan. No wonder that an important part of them fled to the rebels, and they were integrated into their ranks and lived there, and they became rebels, and they became accepted as full members of the in-group. And I think it is important to, and on the other hand, in the government troops, you find many people considered Indians by contemporary criteria. So those groups were clearly heterogeneous. I think what's important is to reflect a bit what were the criteria for differentiating between groups at that time. And the important issues were mostly, of course, were you backing the government or not? And there were questions of lifestyle. So the Maya had two categories for insiders and outsiders. These were Masewal, that were the commoners in terms of colonial period. They later accepted this term for themselves. And the Zul, the difference between Masewal and Zul was not a racial one or a biological one, but a difference in lifestyle and a difference in social position. And that's also, in a certain way, how the Yucatecans from the other side saw it. So to be Indian was not necessarily a biological quality, but was linked and was almost synonymous with being with having a certain social status and being poor. And if you look at the contemporary discourses, you can see, for example, that the elite considered all farmhands and the poorer rural folk as Indians, irrespective of their legal status. For there was a legal separation in Yucatan, as you might have read in the book, between Indians and vecinos. They had different duties, and they were treated administratively and from the administrative perspective differently. But irrespective of this differentiation, the elite view lumped poor rural people and all farmhands together as Indians, considered them Indians, and that helped them to legitimize the use of force in the relations of production. For there was much violence and force employed on the workplaces, and you had to force people to work on the large haciendas. For in the 19th century, in Mexico, as in other regions, there was a scarcity of labor power. Still many people had access to some smaller or larger plots of soil where they could cultivate their foodstuffs. And so they didn't necessarily have to work for the large landowners. And then you had to force people to do that. And the conflation of poor Indian and rural was also had another basis. That was a particular linguistic situation in the Yucatan. That was the widespread use of Yucatec Maya. And this led to a situation where in the countryside and in the smaller towns, almost everybody, Indians and non-Indians alike, spoke only Yucatec Maya and no Spanish. And so from the 20th century perspective, where language has been up to recent times the most important criterion on identifying indigenous populations, from a 20th century perspective, you could have said, well, all these people were Indians, but from the 19th century perspective, they were not. So where different criteria used, and this makes or this can lead to a bit of confusion in the interpretation.
So another aspect of my research focuses on transnationality, because the Mennonites are, I don't know how much you know about Mennonites, but they're an Anabaptist group. So they have colonies throughout Latin America. I think the ones in Campeche were established later than when you were there, but they've recently have some new Mennonite colonies in Campeche. But they have colonies throughout Latin America, and they move between the colonies. So, and they maintain with their Canadian or US passport. So I was interested in how transnationality fed into your study. First off, just like the question is, what are the pros and cons of making a regional study of the Yucatan by focusing on one particular caste work. But you also kind of talk about Belize and how the groups would migrate down to Belize for the mahogany trade. That's how they kind of funded their trips, and then they would head back into the Yucatan. So that even there's some border crossing, and the fixedness of national borders is not as fixed as we sometimes think when we read historical accounts. So just the first question, just in terms of research, what are the pros and cons of making a regional study?
Just a few sentences on the Mennonites. The region where my wife and me worked in the state of Campeche, the municipality of Hopelchen, there were many Mennonites already there in the 1990s.
Okay.
It arrived in the 80s, and we had a number of friends among them, and my wife also did a study of the economy of the Mennonites, comparing it with the household economy of the ejidos, the peasant communities. And, that was very, very interesting, and the Mennonites are particularly interested in the direction you suggest. For on the one hand, they appear so traditional. They are not. They are very selective in their traditionality, and they have, as you will perfectly know, an international network. They have the Mennonitische Post. They are communicating with groups living in other countries. They are traveling quite a lot, so they are moving quite around. The question about making a regional study, one could answer in a general way. I would say conducting a study on a specific region has the advantage over more general research designs. For example, comparing the democracy indicator of 50 countries. The advantage in the regional research is that you can go further in depth, of course, and analyze a number of individual cases in more detail. And this allows you to include a larger number of factors in the study and to better perceive events as part of historical processes and not as single occurrences. On the other hand, there is a challenge not to lose sight of the bigger picture and to embed regional developments in broader, for example, national or global processes. And all regional studies have this kind of challenge or problem, that you don't look too much in the regions on the side, or considering certain polities, for example, the neoliberal polities that emerged in the 1980s in Latin America. And then if you look to Africa, it was quite similar. For that were always IMF-based and World Bank-based programs. Also the certification program in Mexico that was realized in the 1990s. And well, this is a challenge, but I think one can try to overcome it if one looks a bit beyond the limits or the geographical region one focuses on, and takes the time to read a bit of stuff in other fields on other regions. That helps quite a lot. And of course, this is important for understanding the Caste War. For the whole discourse and the whole movement is understandable only when you think about the background, the conflict between the Mexican national government and Great Britain at that time. Great Britain and Mexico had border issues for most of the 19th century, the Belize issue. And therefore, Great Britain backed a bit, not officially, but informally, the rebel movements. And so the rebels could sell their wares in Belize, and they could acquire what they needed, and arms and powder and any other things there. And beyond that, the whole, well, the caste war was not, in Yucatan was not the only peasant indigenous lower class rebellion in Mexico at that time. But in the 1840s and 50s, there were many regional, and 60s, there were many regional rebellions all over the country. And that has much to do with general policies, general land policies, and also the changes in the character of the government, which became much more a representative of local elites than representative of the Spanish king, who was far away and who had often different interests than the local Spanish conquistadors or landowners. And that was important in triggering many of these conflicts. Yeah, that would be my answer.
This might be maybe too big of a question, but do you think that in relation back to the sociology of violence, do you think that I've read some scholars who argue that nation states have curbed violence, and then I've read some scholars who say that nation states have instigated much greater degrees of violence. So if you have an opinion, what would you say? Do you think that the caste war is indicative of nation state kind of imposing a greater degree of violence, or is it much more of a pacification force? Because in your book, you kind of even explained that there's quite a bit of precedence of violence in the region. And now Yucatan is a relatively calm, touristy spot, although with wide inequities between rich and poor. So yeah, that was like another thing when I was reading that, it kind of made me wonder. I'm not even sure what side I fall on that kind of debate, but what do you think the caste war kind of tells us about that question?
Wow, that's a really big question and very difficult to answer. I think all questions that try to quantificate violence are very problematic. I mean, we have a huge debate in the anthropology and sociology of violence about larger trends, and there have been big projects of studying this kind of development, and they have the Pinker thesis that we become more peaceful during the times, and you have other ideas. So I don't know, and I think I'm not sure if we will ever really find out, and if we really can come to a kind of quantification. I would really say that there are certain constellations that foster the use of violence and others that do not. And very important is the differentiation between internal violence and external violence. So if you look, for example, at the conquest of Mexico by the Spaniards, the conquest itself was a tremendously violent process. The result of it was a colonial society that was relatively peaceful. I mean, there were several insurgencies, mostly of smaller smaller insurgencies and rebellions, but more or less the society was not an open conflict, an open violent conflict. And so there were almost no internal wars. And that was different in the Aztec Empire. The Aztec did not try to impose a kind of monopoly of violence. There were internal wars were quite frequent. On the other hand, you have the processes of conquest, not just of Mexico, but also in north of Mexico or in Southern America, the jungle areas, the Amazonia, and the marginal areas. There was tremendous violence involved. So there was much outside violence, but less inside violence, at least open violence in the form of war. I mean, not to talk about domestic violence or beatings or such things. And with relation to the, and I think that's the picture for the state. The state, the development of the state or the implementation of a state kind of political order is almost always accompanied by tremendous violence. For you have to deploy or you have to take away from people parts of their autonomy. So including the possibility to act violently. So the state tries to restrict this. And this cannot be done just by talking. And then if a state order is established, this would mostly result in lesser violence, lesser internal violence, at least up to the time when political or social conflicts or economic inequality becomes so big that there will be major insurrections, rebellions, and civil wars. But states, on the one hand, try to control internal violence, and on the other hand, they are a huge machine to deploy violence against outsiders. That may be marginal groups, or that may be neighboring states or colonies, or areas beyond or on another continent. So, but to quantify it, I wouldn't. I don't think that's possible.
Okay, that's fair enough. And then I've already had you here for about an hour, so I just have one last question I ask everyone, and it's relatively lighter, a much lighter question than
Oh,
what
you're
has
welcome.
is what is one book in your field that you think more people should be reading, beside your own book?
What would you consider my field? Anthropology, Mexico?
For my purposes, we'll say Mexican history that you've read in the sociology of violence and your field in Mexican history.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I mean, there are many very good books in the field. I think anyone interested in anthropology should still have a look at Marvin Harris' The Rise of Anthropological Theory, which is quite dated right now, but I think it's still can still help a lot in clarifying certain ideas about theory, about culture and social processes. About Mexico, one book for the anthropology of violence, I would strongly recommend the work of David Riches, which the late David Riches, who's lamentably has died not so long ago. And that's has nothing to do with Latin America, but helped a lot in developing my ideas on the anthropology of violence. And on Mexico, what would I recommend? I think a very good work is Collier's work on the Chiapas rebellion. So that is that's not on Mexico as a whole, but he develops a historic perspective to understand the Chiapas rebellion of 1994, and I think one can learn quite a lot of it.